To tie a nice little fly, this is a skip's dad. This is a crawdad imitation. If you're into warm water fishing, you've probably seen, especially if you do a lot of tying of warm water flies, you've probably seen Skip Morris's book, The Art of Tying the Bass Fly. This is a pattern that he did in that book and talks about, as well as he has a companion DVD to that book, and he shows you how to tie this fly. I ran across this about 20 years ago and found it to be a nice, effective crawdad pattern. It's very simple to tie. It's not that complicated, and that's one of the reasons I like it, because it's just a quick tie. For many, many years with the beginning fly tying classes that I did, this was one of the flies that I would teach people in our area because they were looking for decent flies that they could go out. They could tie right from the class or from their own vise and go right out and fish. And the skip's dad is one of those. It's a fun pattern to tie, has some interesting techniques to it, but more importantly, it is a very productive pattern as well. So that's the skip's dad. I'll get started. Start the skip's dad with my hook in the vise. I'm using a Mustad 9671 for this. R73 is, I think, the more modern number on that. Traditionally, he uses a 3906 or even a 3906B, something a little bit shorter and a little bit stouter. I like this hook because I like the hook shank to be just a little bit longer. Gives me just a little bit longer body on this. But you could certainly go with the more traditional if you want. I'm using a UTC Ultra thread in a 70 Denier in brown for this. I'm going to attach my thread on an eye length from the eye of the hook. I'm going to advance my thread down to just between the point of the hook and the barb of the hook. This is where I'm going to tie in the dumbbell eyes. For this size hook, this is a size 6, I'm using a medium unpainted lead dumbbell eyes. You could use a painted if you want, but this thing's going to be bouncing around on the bottom, and that paint will get chipped off. I find the unpainted works just as well. I'm going to tie this in so that, like I said, those are right above that space right between the point of the hook and the end of the barb, because that's where our thorax is more or less going to start. I have to put a little ball of dubbing right on the back side of this side by the bend. So I'm going to secure those eyes in with my thread hanging on the back side of the eyes along the bend. And I'm going to take and put some head cement right on those thread wraps. That's just going to help secure that in a little bit better. We're going to be tying in and doing most of the work actually inside the gap of the hook here with the hook inverted. This is how it's actually going to swim in the water. I'm going to put some claws in here made from pheasant tail fibers, but I want to put a ball of dubbing right here to help to keep those claws separated. For dubbing, I'm using a Dave Whitlock's, this is an SLF dubbing. This is actually the red fox squirrel color. It's kind of a nice brownish color. I think it goes well with the pheasant tail fibers, but you could use an olive or another color if you like. I'm going to make kind of a sparse dubbing noodle. I don't want this really, really bulky and thick, even though we are going to put a substantial little ball of dubbing back there. I find that I would rather have it sparse and long because the extra wraps will actually go in and on top of that dubbing and will help hold it in better as opposed to all of it being concentrated in one area and just getting a wrap or two in there, and then the dubbing starts to fall apart. You can see I'm wrapping this in right at the base of those dumbbell eyes to broaden that out. I want that to be a nice pronounced little ball of dubbing right there. Yep. And then I can flip this over and you can see I've got just enough here that's going to help to spread apart those claws. As I said, the claws on the skipstad are made from pheasant tail fibers. There's basically two sections you're going to tie in here. I've got maybe 20 barbs. I tend to look at it as I got about a half an inch on the rachis of that feather that I'm going to use these barbs for a claw. Trim those off. I want to collect those so that the tips are fairly even. It's going to look kind of ragged. It doesn't look perfect. That's all right. I don't need these tips to be all nice and even. I want them actually a little bit different. And I'm going to tie in my claws about the length of the shank of the hook, maybe the length of the overall hook. I'm going to place those, see if I can do this your way so you can see it better. I'm going to place those right in the gap of the hook over the dumbbell eyes there and on the side of that dubbing ball, and then I'm going to wrap across. So just like I wrapped in the dumbbell eyes, I'm wrapping across here. That's going to bind in one set of claws in one direction. I will get the next set, which is going to be about the same width. They're a little different. It's not going to be, one's a little thinner, one's a little thicker. It's not going to be terrible. These I'm going to tie in on my side, on the opposite side in the opposite direction. And I will then go, kind of hard for me to do this because I'm not seeing it that well. Now I'll go the opposite direction on the inside there, and I will get that other set of claws wrapped in. Now, one thing I want to point out to you, two things actually. One, these are longer than I like. Some people will tie their crawdad imitations with real long claws to them, but there studies have been done that the fish actually prefer the shorter claws. I mean, if you think about it, if you're going after, this is going to end up maybe an inch, inch and a half long. If you're going after a crawdad that size, or even 2 inches, if he's got or she's got real big claws, then they're going to fight back. But if you get them, the fish can key in on these where they have smaller claws, or the crawdad itself is smaller, and then they have less issues with them potentially getting harmed. The second thing is, so I'll retie this in just a second, but the second thing is, notice that both of these claws aren't the same length. When I tie the skipstad, I often like to tie these such that one claw is shorter than the other. The reason for that is the crawdads will fight. Crawdads will fight for territory or for mating, whatever it is that they fight for, and the claws will actually get pulled off. They regenerate, they grow them back. So it's not uncommon for the fish to find crawdads running around with one larger claw and one smaller claw. So if you want to maybe add another realistic element to this fly, then you could tie these in and where one's just a little bit shorter than the other. That's what I'm going to do. I think I got just enough wraps on here. This one that's long here, I can just pull it the other way. So I can either even those up, or I'm going to go just a little bit shorter than the first one I put in. So I'll get a few more wraps in, kind of crisscrossing those, making certain I've got those wrapped in real well. Now I'm going to collect all of the butt ends just on the forward side of the dumbbell eyes. I'm actually going to collect those and bring those up towards the top here like this. And I'm going to get a couple of thread wraps on there to secure that. Next step is going back to our dubbing. We need to cover up these thread wraps and these thread wraps right in the center of the eyes and the legs. So I'm going to go back to my dubbing. Again, another sparse, longer noodle, probably 3 inches, I would say at least. You don't want to, it's by the nature of it with those lead eyes there and the dubbing and the claws and everything we're putting in here. This is a thorax area right here. It's going to be a little thicker than our abdomen and certainly our tail section, the way this is designed. So you don't necessarily have to be putting on a whole bunch of dubbing in here because it won't take much. All I'm going to do is crisscross the same wraps that I did before when I bound in the claws. I'm going to do here to cover up all the thread wraps underneath and all the thread wraps in the middle. So that gets that all covered up. Now our pinchers or claws, whatever you want to call them, are all tied in. They're secured. I'm going to now wrap down on the rest of these pheasant tail fibers here, just a little bit, securing those down. Do not cut these off. Not yet. We're going to use those. I'm going to tie in my rib. The rib is, I'm using a Lagartun's large copper wire. I'm going to tie this in now. Not cooperating that much. And then wrap my thread back towards the dumbbell eyes. Now, the reason why I do that is, one, to secure that rib in here. Two, we're going to use these remaining pheasant tail barbs for our shellback and tail. So I'm going to collect those. And that's why I was also taking care to make certain they're wrapped on the top, this side of the hook shank. Now with my thread back up by the dumbbell eyes, I can very easily wrap those down and bind those in. Then I can wrap all that down. You don't have to really worry about putting a thread dam here or transition because we're going to fill all this space up with dubbing. So once again, we go back to our dubbing. I usually find, I'm certain you can do this quicker. If you take a look at the video I did on Dave Whitlock's Near Enough Sculpin or crayfish, he uses a technique with this SLF of wrapping in a very, very bulky dubbing while you're actually wrapping the thread along. And that's a technique that you can use. I just find I have better control if I just have a thinner, longer dubbing noodle. So obviously we're going to want to have this kind of tapered. I like to just go ahead and wrap this on in. I don't want to go much more than an eye length behind the eye of the hook. I have a tail and other components to tie in. Now here's another reason why I like doing it this way. Notice that as I'm wrapping back up here to apply some more dubbing, my thread wrap's going on top of that existing dubbing. So it's really, for me, it's securing it down to the hook even better. Again, if I were to just really make a bulky noodle and or tie that in, they call it speed dubbing, I could have chunks of that dubbing that aren't really bound in that well that easily get pulled out. Maybe I'm splitting hairs or splitting dubbing there. I don't know. Just things to consider when you're doing your own flies. There's nothing wrong if dubbing, especially twisting the dubbing on the thread like this, is a challenge. It's a skill that you're working on or whatever. Don't hesitate to just do it in multiple layers. I'll add in some more here, making certain to wrap this kind of bulky right up against the dumbbell eyes and starting to put that taper in. Don't worry if this doesn't have just a beautiful taper. As this fly is fished and bounces and drags along the bottom of the stream, some of this dubbing is going to get kind of pulled out and it's going to get kind of shaggier. It's one of those flies I find that really it fishes. The more you fish it, the better it fishes. So I'm about an eye length behind the eye of the hook, maybe a little bit less. Now I'm going to take all those remaining pheasant tail fibers, these barbs here. Now make certain you're not grabbing any of your pinchers here because they can easily get mixed up. I'm going to put these under a little bit of tension, pulling this way. I'm going to bring them right down and bring my thread right over. A couple of wraps here. Now notice I'm keeping the pheasant tail on top of the hook shank, and I'm using the thread to pull it down to the hook shank. I don't want it to go down and around the hook shank. I just want it right on top there. And again, do not cut this off yet. Now we'll take the rib. I'm going to bring it straight across, and I'm going to get about 4 wraps in here just to segment the body a little bit. This also helps to protect those pheasant tail fibers. I'm going to tie that in, secure that down, and then supporting the hook with the bobbin here, I will twist this to fatigue that wire off rather than try and cut it. Just a little easier. So now our skipstad is almost completed. What we're going to do is we're going to take the remaining pheasant tail barbs here. We're going to split those up. We're going to bring them down around the underside here. We're going to use these as a tail. I want to bring these down around the underside and get them all nice and even. I don't want any bumps and any stragglers. I'm going to bring my thread around the other side. And then I'm going to wrap this in and make kind of a thread dam. As I make the head of the fly here, this is just kind of help wedge those down in place. So that they will stay on the underside. Once I have that done, I can go ahead and put in a whip finish here. Angle this a little different just so that we do it this way so that you can see that. We'll probably need to sweep these out of the way. Takes a little coordination, sometimes juggling all of this stuff in your hands so you don't get a bunch of those pheasant tail barbs all wrapped in. Now, the last thing that I'm going to do, actually second to last here, is I'm going to trim these back. I don't need these quite this long. This is a short little crawdad, so I want this to basically be in proportion with the rest of the crawdad. I'm going to trim these maybe about 1/4 of an inch long, just right across there. Then the last thing that I'm going to do, after some head cement on those thread wraps, is I'm going to put some hard as hull on this. You could use a Dave's Flex Cement if you want. You could use, I don't like epoxy on this because it gets a little bit too rigid. If you had some flexible UV or something, you could put some of that on here. I'm just simply smearing some on both sides of those fibers so that it's going to help stiffen those up a little bit and make them a little bit more durable. Don't worry if these aren't sticking out just like a perfect little crawdad tail. They're going to get busted up. They're going to get banged up and everything, but they'll at least still be in that general vicinity of the tail, so they'll represent, and that's the idea of it. So the hardest hull, with it being on these simple fibers, is not quite as rigid. The Dave's Flex Cement will work well. Probably even use some rubber cement or something like that if you want. Just a little something to make the fibers a little bit more durable, not necessarily rigid. And there you have it. That is the Skip's Dad. Great little crawdad imitation that works really, really well when you're sight fishing, when you've got some shallow water. I'm trying to level this up a little bit here. You got some shallower water, maybe that's running a little bit clearer. It's easier for you to see. You can sight fish to some smallmouth or trout with this. I think this also works really well under a strike indicator. So if you've got a hole that you want to fish, you know there's fish down in there, you want to bounce a crawdad imitation in there, you can put it under a strike indicator and nymph it down through there. I think it works pretty well because of the weight on that. That's the Skip's Dad. Thanks for watching today. Thanks for joining me at the Vise today. I hope you learned at least a new pattern, if not a new technique, maybe a tip or trick here and there. If you have any questions about this fly or any of the techniques used in constructing this pattern, please leave them in the comments section down below. If you go to the trouble to ask a question, I'll go to the trouble to answer it. If you'd like to help dressed irons, please share this video with your friends and anybody you think that might enjoy this pattern. Until next time, remember, it's fly tying. If you're not having fun, then you're doing it wrong.